Okay, welcome everyone to our Ornamental IPM webinar, September 23rd, 2025. And this is our last webinar of the season. So I thank you all for joining us. We're going to be recording this webinar, so we'll have time at the end for questions. So save all those to the end, or you can always type them into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm Bill Erickson. I'm the agriculture agent in Monmouth County for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, also joined by Steve Retke, our IPM program associate, Tim Waller, our ag agent from Cumberland County, and Aaron Quinn, who is our IPM program support. And just a reminder, that we're going to be talking about some materials and chemicals today, but you always want to follow the regulations in your state. If you're in a state other than New Jersey, pay attention to that. And whether you're a commercial farm, commercial nursery versus a landscaper, there are different restrictions that can apply. So always follow the label and the laws for your state. Whoa, sorry. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about some beneficial insects. There's a lot of mums moving around the industry right now. We'll talk about those. The white pine aphid is showing up. I've got some conifer pests I'm going to talk about and some updates on some adelgids that we saw earlier in the season. And then Tim is going to talk about some mite issues and fall sanitation and fall irrigation, things that we can focus on over the next month or so. And then Steve is going to wrap things up, some good considerations for a nursery IPM program, and then a brief intro to using dormant oils, which are really important this time of the year. If you look on the bottom too, you'll see our growing degree day trackers. So we're at about 2,900 in North Jersey, Central New Jersey is just over 3,100, and 3,360 in Southern New Jersey. So we've accumulated quite a bit of thermal units throughout the season. We're all, around 3,000 or plus throughout the state this time of year. So just some updates before we get into that. I want to talk for a minute about record keeping. This is really important, and this is how we learn each year, how we get better at seeing what actually worked and how effective it was, the materials, the concentration, the timing. Did we achieve what we were trying to achieve? And the better records we keep, the better we can look at that as the season, as we go into the next season. Some things we have to keep track of, right? Because it's the law, and we have to keep track of our applications. But then being specific and taking pictures too can be really helpful. And we're always happy to help to review records with folks, over the fall and winter. That's a good downtime to review all of these things and see what worked. What kind of pest were we trying to target? Did we get the control that we were looking for from that material? And then we can make a good solid plan for next year based on what we observed. So do we need to adjust our timing a little bit? Did we miss the window? We'll have time over the winter to look at that. So you can always reach out to our offices if you want to get into that and review some things together. We're happy to help with that. Okay, so check out our website also. Just remember, all these webinars get recorded and posted to the website. There's also a pest and disease database that's been created on the website. So you can see all of these issues are listed on there. You can choose them alphabetically or by order of date. So we're going to refer back to some of the things that we talked about earlier in the season. Now we're seeing a second generation without going back into the whole issue. You can go back and use that as a resource. So this is one of our first insect we're going to talk about, a beneficial insect, and I should have a question mark after that. These are praying mantids. So several species in the Stagmomantis genus. And I would say it's a question mark as to being a beneficial insect because these are definitely predaceous insects. They're voracious predators, but they feed on just about anything they can catch. So that would include pest insects, flies, beetles, things like that. But also it could include some of our beneficials. So our moths and bees and pollinators and things like that, they could eat those as well. Kind of indiscriminate into what they're going to consume. We see them in our landscapes or in our nurseries regularly, and we know that they are predators, but they're kind of have a neutral gain. There's not much net gain because they're very indiscriminate on what they're consuming. So this is some images of the young mantids coming out of their egg sac. And in the top middle there too, you can see the egg case. And they're going to start laying their eggs this time of year. And you may see these around the landscape or the nursery. And you may wonder what that is. Sometimes it might look like it's a gall on the plant or something, but that's actually a praying mantid egg case. They can also look a little bit similar to spotted lanternfly eggs. So if you see those, on the bark, they're a little bit flatter. They look a little bit more like spackle, I would say. You can refer back to some of the images, but I have, seen some pictures, or people brought some pictures in that were, not sure what it was, and those things can get confused. So that's a good picture of the egg case there. And the young, you can see the exoskeleton being shed in the on the bottom of the screen, and consuming insects also, pretty large insects that they're able to catch and consume. So seeing praying mantids in the landscape or in the nursery might be a good indication, though, that you have good biodiversity at your site. And so anytime we're, reducing our broad spectrum insecticides, we're going to see praying mantids and other insect ecology and biodiversity develop. So even though they may be a net neutral in terms of their benefit for attacking pest organisms, they could be a good indicator that things are in a pretty good balance. Because, and if we want to keep it that way, again, monitoring, spraying only when necessary, avoiding blanket applications, avoiding broad spectrum materials, and using reduced risk as much as possible. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about just some visuals on mums. I've got a lot of mums being transported around the industry right now, being either shipped out of nurseries or into retail garden centers, or from a wholesaler to a reseller, or from the farm. So there's a lot of mums moving around, and there's just some things we want to look out for, especially in the context of not contaminating or infecting other plants where you're introducing these mums. So if you're sending things out the door, or if you're receiving them, set them aside, make sure somebody's going through them and looking at them and seeing what we might observe. And so these are some insect issues and one abiotic issue. But on the left, you can see chrysanthemum leaf miner damage. You can see the galleries, going through the leaves there. You see some caterpillar feeding damage on the bottom, two spotted spider mites on the top middle, and then thrips damage on the bottom center. So a lot of these insects, we've talked about throughout the program, and you can find some information on them, specific to those insects on the website if you look them up. We also see premature budding if cool nighttime temperatures happen, so that's an abiotic issue. But just some things to keep an eye out for. And then some really important things to notice, and these are some things that could potentially infect your other plants if they're not just dealt with appropriately, or if you don't dispose of the plants appropriately. So these are some disease issues. On the left, those two pictures are Pythium. You see those black stems starting to form close to the base of the plant. That's an indication that you may want to lift that plant out of the pot and take a look at the roots. And if you see the roots getting, starting to rot, turning brown, that color, that could be Pythium, and that can affect a lot of different plants. It's an oomycete, so the spores can travel through water and through irrigation systems. And if you have those, in an area of your operation, you may want to remove them, dispose of them properly, get rid of them. In the middle, we see Fusarium. It's another root pathogen. We can see it presenting in the leaves as well, because they're not able to get water and nutrients up to the leaves and start to die back. But again, you want to pull those plants out of the pots and see what's going on. And then Rhizoctonia, it's another pathogen, and that will actually create some of this, webbing like signs on the leaves themselves. So you see it presenting like that above ground. You can see the darkening stems, and again, pull those out, take a look at the roots. There's also several leaf spot issues Mums can get both bacterial and fungal leaf spots. You see those two on the top left, and they can be a problem. You may not want to contaminate your other plants. Septoria leaf spot as a fungal pathogen. It can affect a lot of different species. But then on the right, this is a real big problem, is chrysanthemum white rust. And this is a quarantine significant pathogen. So that's one that you really want to be aware of. And you want to call someone, you want to call us and call the regulators if this comes in and you see that and you observe that. So just some things to look out for. And I bring this up, these visuals, inspect them if you're receiving them or if you're shipping them out. Be careful not to contaminate existing stock. So put it into a kind of a temporary quarantine area and inspect it before you receive it, or if it's new. Minimize your overhead irrigation and leaf wetness. And then Tim's going to talk about sanitation later. And this is really important. Dispose of these culls properly. You don't want to dispose of them into a pile that's going to just go back into compost or, contaminate potentially other plants you have. A couple good resources there too that'll be in the handout from the slideshow. University of Kentucky and Clemson have some good resources on that. Okay, one of the insects that we're seeing high activity on right now is white pine aphid. We're going to talk about a few different conifer pests. So for our Christmas tree growers and conifer nurseries, these are some things that you can look for now and that are actionable right now also. So the white pine aphid, this is actually a pretty large aphid. They're about 1/4 inch long, dark colored, and they have a white stripe and white spots on them. Several generations, but this time, September, October is when they're going to have really high activity. And this is also the egg laying generation. So if we can get a control now, we can prevent them from laying eggs and prevent that next generation from occurring next year. So there's a lot of things that we can do this time of year that are going to help us out in the spring. And this can be proactive to get them before they can lay those eggs. So they start to get more active with cool temperatures, and we're going to see a lot of honeydew. So I'll show you some pictures of that. And because that these are a large aphid species, you can see them feeding here and producing a lot of honeydew, which is going to bring in a lot of sooty mold. You may see ant activity or wasp activity, and go inspect that and go scout your white pine trees if you grow them. So they don't actually feed on the needles, but they feed like right at the base where the needles are going into the stem. We see that in the center picture there. On the left, you can see the eggs that they've laid. So they lay these black eggs along the needles. And so you can scout for those too a little bit later in the season. But this time of year, if you see this dark sooty mold aphid activity on the pines, or on the right, you can see them crawling on the bark. Go and check that out and inspect it, because this is a good control window to try to address them. So there are some natural predators. If you have small infestations, you can syringe them, spray them with water, or prune out heavily infested branches, manual removal. But we've got some good biorationals that can be effective this time of year too. So azadirachtin is effective, and then our horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps are also going to be effective for these soft-bodied aphids. And Steve's going to talk about those a little bit later too. It's going to be a good window of time in the fall for our insecticidal soaps and oils. Pyrethroids, broad spectrum, we kind of want to reserve those as a last resort because they can affect non-target organisms. And imidacloprid can be effective also. We got to get that on with enough time for it to be able to get into the plants and be effective. And these are just some updates. We're seeing a resurgence of adelgid activity. So if you remember, we talked about these in the spring, the eastern spruce gall adelgid, and they feed on the trees and they lay their eggs and they create these galls. And this time of year, the next generation is emerging from the galls. And that generation that's coming out of the galls is going to be the overwintering generation. So we've got this window where if you see that, a gall or something that looks kind of like that on your spruce trees, you can go and look for it, see if the adelgids are starting to come out, and then they're at a vulnerable stage. And if we take care of them now, then they won't overwinter. And even if we reduce their populations greatly now, and then we need a second application in the spring, we can be effective. And this time of year also, once the galls open, And when they're still on the plants, our oils and our soaps can be really effective materials. And so those are good reduced risk materials. They're not going to have a big effect on non-target organisms. And that link in that QR code, that'll take you back to our website when we had additional information on the Eastern Spruce Gall Adelgid, because we talked about this earlier in the spring. And so this is just our later season update. Another adelgid that we see affecting spruce is the Cooley Spruce Gall Adelgid. Same concept is that the overwintering generation of adelgids are going to start to come out of these galls, and they're vulnerable to treatment. So we've got a good window to be effective right now. Now, these galls look a little bit different. So it's a different insect. They create a different gall on the spruce. But if you see those, irregular formations on the plants, you go and inspect them and look and wait to see if they're coming out, and then we can start to treat them. So our soaps and oils, again, can be effective this time of year. And then for anybody who's growing hemlocks or maintaining hemlocks in the landscape, we know that the hemlock woolly adelgid is a major pest, and right now we've got our second generation of nymphs. We've got a good window of treatment for them. So they're developing, they're going to be the overwintering stage. And so going into the fall, they're vulnerable. So they haven't created that woolly wax that helps to protect them. And so if we can treat them before they create that woolly wax and cover themselves, then this can be a good treatment window, and we can prevent and reduce their numbers for next season. So it's something that we can do in the fall to get a head start on next season. So horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps, again, can be really effective for this insect when we time it correctly. All right, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, hey everyone. I'm the middleman today. Steve is very excited to be the anchor man. He's going to be talking about some topics that I'm going to be covering, as well as Bill has already covered. But first, we wanted to start with some updates related to mite activity that we have seen earlier this season, and we're about to start seeing as we're getting into those cooler nights, cooler days. And we're going to see a resurgence in a lot of mite activity. Of particular importance is the spruce spider mite. There were numerous days very early in the spring and kind of as summer started getting going where people were seeing all kinds of damages on conifers. So spruce spider mite is a cool season mite. If you look at the little graph there in the center, we can see as we're moving towards September, October timeframe, we're going to have this big resurgence of these pests. And if their spring populations were any indication of how impactful this could be, this is really important for us, especially if you've dealt with this in your conifers. This could be Christmas trees. I saw it on all kinds of other conifers in the nursery setting. You really should be on guard and monitoring for this and being ready to have some type of spray program in place. So like the other slides here, because we talked about this, the QR code for this slide and a few more are going to take you back to the website with a little bit more broad information about it. But what's really important here is that you are monitoring for this. So I threw the image up of the actual spruce spider mite. This is something that it does take quite a bit of magnification. If you're local to Cumberland County, you could bring a sample over to my office and we'll take a look at it with a microscope. Or we can get a sample sent up to the plant diagnostic lab. There are a lot of materials that are available to control these pests. And understanding what that material does can be really important. So the mites are all going to be overwintering as eggs. Something like hexathiazox, which can reduce the survivability of those eggs, could be a valuable tool a little bit later on in the season. But up until then, we've got a lot of options available to us. Just keep an eye out for this, and don't forget that you can do the paper trick where you beat the branches onto the paper and look for mite populations. All right, so the next one uh, okay, so yeah, so the next one here are the rust mites. So rust mites are incredibly difficult to see the actual organism itself with a hand lens. However, because of the way their life cycle works, oftentimes you'll be able to see cast skins. So the hemlock rust mite is aptly named. Most likely going to see this on hemlock. There are some reports that you could see this on firs. However, if you're monitoring for this, we're looking for this yellowish discoloration that could be surrounding all the different parts of the needle. And when we're looking at it with a hand lens, we might not see the insect or the arachnid, but there's a good chance that we'll see the cast skins. This mite is a little bit different than some of our other mites because it will be on the top part of the leaf surface as well as the bottom part of the leaf surface. There are a number of materials that work for this, very much similar treatment approaches, but what Steve is going to be talking about later, getting into the horticulture dormant oils, that can be a really important part of this overall practice. Something to be said too, and Steve's probably going to get into it. If you are thinking you're dealing with this pest and it's in a variety that has more of a bluish hue or coloration, be mindful of using the horticulture oils on that particular crop. All right, well, Bill, can you go back 2 slides, please? There we go. Okay, so sorry about that. Jumped over this one. So the 2 pests that we just talked about, those are the ones we're going to see in conifers. The hemlock is going to be more of a host-specific pest. The spruce spider mite is going to be pretty much across the board in conifers. Particularly, take a good look at your arborvitaes. However, the southern red spider mite, this is really where we're going to focus on looking for this is in evergreen broadleaf plants. I saw a lot of this early season. I saw a lot of damages caused by this pest as kind of the summer started to kick in, and we're really starting to see elongation, discoloration. And by taking a closer look, started to notice that yes, we do have these southern red spider mites. The name is a bit of a misnomer. We're going to find these throughout the Northeast region. So they very much are around and they can be prevalent. Again, being aware that we're in multiple generations and this organism is going to overwinter in its egg form can really help us detail what type of materials we're going to be using. There's a lot of contacts. There are some systemics or translaminar materials. And then the biorational group here is very important. Just be mindful if you've been using a miticide without rotating, it's very likely time to reevaluate that because you may be building up pesticide resistance unknowingly. All right, so next I want to talk about sanitation. So we've brought this up a few times, but I am, lo and behold, I am a plant pathologist. What is so important about sanitation is that this is how we guard our future selves from dealing with problems that are currently happening. So when I say sanitation, I'm talking about diseases. That's the whole gamut. I use the word bugs here very loosely, but that's all the creepy crawlies that are coming after our plants. And then weeds, which are intimately important, not only as a reserve for weeds or weed seeds, but they're also a reservoir for both our insects as well as many of our diseases. So the more effort we put in this time of year, the better off we're gonna be dealing with our problems, especially when our covers are still on and our sprays are limited. All right, so first I wanted to start with weed management because this time of year it's really, really important. Like I said before, it's a overwintering reservoir or a physical space that many of our insects, mites, fungi, bacteria, oomycetes can persist throughout the season when the environmental conditions aren't great for them to attack or otherwise infect new plant material. Additionally, the more weeds that we can get out this time of year, the better off we're going to be when it comes to dealing with weeds right when we're trying to ship early on in the season. So some generalized practices here, best management practices. The best you can stay weed-free is just going to be overall a good thing. Being cognizant of where your compost, your growing media, soil for that matter, being mindful where you're getting it from, and are there weeds local to that area that could get into there that could cause a problem a little bit later on. If you're potting up from liners, it's a good practice to remove that top inch or so that could be infested with weed seed. So if we can get that out of the system, that can be beneficial a little bit later on. What I mean by investigating barriers is if you're using something like rice hulls, take note of did 1 inch, did half an inch, etc. of a rice hull, did that perform the way that we had anticipated? And then monitoring for weeds throughout your cropping system can be really beneficial when it comes to identifying a location where we need to do something. And then just evaluating if you were using pre-emergence, really evaluating were they effective, were they not effective? And that's something that we should collectively talk about. I just wanted to point out here, if you have, and we all do to some extent, but if you have nostoc, you have areas with a lot of algae, you've got liverwort either on the matting material or within the plants. If you have these things, it's indicative of there being high moisture levels or sustained moisture levels and high levels of nutrients. You put those two things together, that is the perfect place for many of our pathogens, particularly our root disease pathogens, both fungal and oomycetes, to persist for very long periods of time, and it can cause us headache after headache after headache. The QR codes here take you to different resources, one for nostoc through Rutgers, one for algae through Oklahoma State, and then another for liverworts through Michigan State. And just being mindful of our ground cloths. Generally, if you are getting ready to move plants into a house, or you're getting ready to prepare a house that is going to house things that you're propagating, the more organic matter you can remove out of that system or physically remove it out of the system, the better off you're going to be. We can clean down those surfaces and use things like detergents. It's not just our floor mats either. It's everything in that house. If we can get that cleaned and sanitized, that much better we're going to be when it comes to dealing with our issues. Sanitizing with the appropriate products. Not all materials are suitable for things like galvanized steel or wood or landscape fabrics. And just be mindful of what you're putting back into that location. As I've said many times, a very realistic person, but when it comes to dealing with problems, particularly disease problems, if you can rotate where those plants are going to be grown across the span of multiple seasons, we're effectively doing a crop rotation, which is an extremely powerful tool when it comes to disease management. If you have plants that are prone to pest issues, particularly something like red-headed flea beetle, it is not advisable to have plants that you are holding over and then putting new plants of that same type, let's say Itea, for example, into that same house or in a localized area close to it. That's just asking for more problems next year. And we all have this too, where you walk into a hoop house and there's that one area that has kind of pulled up. That area right there is the exact spot where I would suspect things like Phytophthora, Pythium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia to be more prevalent. We see this a lot when we're doing our Phytophthora sampling. Anytime water is pooling up in a location, or the next image where maybe you have an emitter that is dripping a little bit more than it should be, those really should be corrected in a timely fashion. If you have to put a slit into the flooring, add in some gravel or whatever substrate you have underneath to get it level to avoid this pooling effect, the better off you're going to be throughout the entire house, because we're reducing the inoculum location. Put it into perspective, the way that we kill plants for evaluations is that we put them in these very similar conditions. So anything you can do to avoid that, the better off you're going to be. And then just sanitation. If there's leaf litter on the ground, there's potential problems on the ground. Um, this is going to take many forms. This is weeds, this is drop foliage, etc. And just to put it into perspective, if we've got one leaf on the ground that is covered in fungal fruiting structures, in this case, these are pycnidia. If we've got that one leaf has thousands of spores. How many does it take for us to really move into another full-blown infestation very early in the year, in the following year? If we think about the conditions that occur before we have fully removed our plastic off of our hoop houses, yes, we've cut some slits, we're getting some venting, but we all know what it's like when you walk into those houses and it's hot and humid and it's very early in March. We can have explosive populations of pathogens if we didn't put the right effort into sanitizing our houses the fall prior. And then if you've got downtime, you've got people that you need to do that you need them to do activities, make sure that you are sanitizing everything that we're using for interacting with our plants. Yeah, I know it's not always practical in the middle of April to do it on a large context, but this is definitely something that should be a fall and winter approach. And it takes many forms. The more sanitary we can be when it comes to dealing with pests, diseases, and weeds, the less problems we're going to have, the less headaches we're going to have throughout the season. All right, and I just wanted to talk about one more point with this is one more point here is, so we all lived through the last 2 years. Anecdotally, and I'm going to talk about some examples, but anecdotally, we all know how impactful drought can be in an acute sense. We know when plants are drought stricken. However, what we've kind of been learning over the last couple of years is what happens that next season. What happens when buds terminate as soon as they've opened? What happens when we've got all this extra nutrient load, but there's not enough water to use it? We're going to get into all kinds of problematic issues when it's related to irrigation. So in the greenhouse setting, we've got the advantage of being able to control our irrigation. Oftentimes we use a little bit more than we should, and we get into pest and disease issues. But in a field setting, many times we'll have some semblance of irrigation, whether that's with a cannon, with a hard hose, a reel, maybe you've got drip irrigation out there, but usually we don't think to deploy that after those trees or shrubs have been in the ground for a year or two. It's much more of an afterthought than the primary thought. However, what we're seeing as time progresses is that that can be a real problem. So the image that you're looking at here, this is a NOAA link, drought.gov. That's the big QR code. Will take you there. It's a really cool website. There's all kinds of cool things to investigate, but what we're looking at is the long-term potential drought situation that we're dealing with here in New Jersey. So as you can see, looking at that, we do have some areas of white. That means that they've got approximately the average appropriate amount of moisture status for that particular location. But if we look at some of the nursery regions, particularly down here in Cumberland County, we've got abnormally dry, and then we're approaching drought-like conditions. We're seeing that towards the Delaware, and then we're seeing it right up through the center of the state. So what this means is that even though it may have rained a couple times, we've had a very strange season, and what is so important is that we have fall irrigation. I also wanted to throw out that Rutgers has a New Jersey weather network. A lot of cool information there too. We all know how important the weather is when it comes to agriculture. And the reason I'm going on and on about this stuff is that when it comes to plants that are overwintering in the field, yes, during active growth periods, they do need water. They need water plus nitrogen equals plant growth. However, if they are not properly hydrated going into the cold winter months where irrigation in a field setting can be extremely difficult, we're asking for some pretty significant damages. Over the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of tip dieback that was I tested it for everything possible. Bud death, again, tested for everything possible. And we always kept coming back to this was probably related to the really, really dry fall that we had the last couple of years. And really what winter injury is, it's the plants are going through a drought during those very cold months. On our broadleaf evergreens, we're going to see this on the actual foliage because it's a very dry and windy condition, and we're going to have very cold winter conditions. So roughly an inch of water per week is what is needed throughout our fall period. So we should be monitoring the weather and irrigating as appropriate. And again, if plants are not irrigated during this fall season or getting appropriate ambient rainfall, there's going to be a real problem there. All right. And do we have Steve back on the line?
Yes, we do, Tim. I'm back.
All right, excellent.
All right, I could get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I had the honor to be the final topics for our last session. But when I'm finished, I will swing things back over to Tim Waller, and he'll close us out with some concluding remarks, some future plans, and some various updates. But today I'm going to talk about some questions if you're considering regarding a nursery IPM program. If you're thinking about setting one up, there's some basic fundamental questions you need to answer. And then also I'll finish up with a primer on dormant oil applications, as well as just general verdant or in-season oils as well. All right, so it's important to realize, and I think most of everyone knows this, is that the integrated pest management approach is more complex than the more traditional historical method from decades ago, where we weren't doing monitoring, we weren't gathering a whole lot of information. We were just basically doing some broadcast cover treatments, large block areas, just assuming there's some problems there, and we're just making applications as a matter of, as an insurance to make things looking okay. However, if you're going to establish a monitoring, it's I put down 11 questions that you really need to kind of ask yourself. And so I'll go over those one by one. And actually, it should be 10, but I kind of grouped one with another one. So I ended up being 11. But that photograph there, I mean, that's the future trend with nursery IPM. It's the use of drones for nursery monitoring as well as spray applications. It's certainly been in the works for a while now. I'm not going to talk about drones, but that'll be a future trend, no question, as the years go by. Okay. All right, so the first thing to know is that if you're going to start an IPM program for your nursery, are you going to be able to have the proper staff to perform the monitoring? That's the key thing. You know, the big difference between IPM and the other, pest management approaches is monitoring, because if you're not monitoring, you're not doing IPM, because, it's an information intensive type of a gathering process, and so you must do some scouting and get that information so you can make decisions of what you should do. And so finding the right personnel is a bit of a challenge, and so that's the first hurdle you're going to have to try to overcome. Selecting the proper staff carefully is really important. There's some people who are more prone to be accepting of this type of responsibility. They enjoy monitoring, looking at plants, trying to find problems, whereas other people just look at that as being tedious and just a total bore. And so obviously those types of personnel are not the ones you want to choose. But the key thing to know is that to be able to monitor, it does require a certain level of knowledge and experience for it to be effective and to be efficient, and most importantly, to be profitable. And so now one thing you could consider if you are thinking about putting it together in IPM, if you don't find the people there at your staff presently, even though more than often than not, people have been around with a nursery for years, they just naturally develop, some important monitoring skills because they look for problems, not necessarily, but that they just look and they see them. And so they become familiar with what the certain problem plants are and what some of the insects or even diseases are. And so that's the beginning process of it. And so you could, if you really wanted to get things started in a hurry, because that type of a learning process does take time. And so you could hire a credentialed consultant, and that's certainly possible. It's going to be maybe a little bit on the pricey side, and you wouldn't want to more likely continue that for too many years, but maybe a season or two and work with some of the staff that you think are going to be your future scouts that will be responsible for this type of information gathering. That's what you'd want to maybe look at doing. And so yeah, that's probably the fastest way to improve an IPM program and get it off and running is to hire someone from the outside. All right, so then another thing you have to make the decision. And initially, when you're just starting, that the people who are going to be doing monitoring, they're going to probably need some assistance, and so they're not going to be able to do a lot of immediate decision making on their own, and so they're going to require an outside source for consultation to know where you want to maybe make an interaction or intervention if there's a problem. But as that experience increases, over maybe hopefully just a couple, 2, 3 years or so, they will have developed enough knowledge where you can rely on them to making in-field decision choices, and you don't have to delay that process of reaching out to somebody else and making a decision what should be done. You can do it on site at the time, and so it really improves your timeliness of certain types of applications. And so that's another thing that has to be worked out over time with any nursery that's starting an IPM program. I just happened to notice this photograph. I had to put it in there. That's a sarsis. It's a red bud. It's a variety that I'd never seen before, but this is absolutely gorgeous. So anyway. And so another thing is that you need to try to maybe write some things down. That's a critical thing because one of the important things about IPM is record keeping, having information of what you've seen in the past and keeping that from 1 year to the next. And so it's good to maybe have a site-specific field manual that you develop over time. And some of the key things to help simplify this process is that there are such concepts, they're called key plants, or key pests, key locations. And so you learn certain plants that are more prone to get a certain type of a pest at a certain time of the year and maybe at a certain location in your nursery. And so that's really important information because it speeds up the monitoring process and you kind of anticipate where to look for problems in the future. And so, well, one of the challenges with nursery IPM as compared to landscape IPM is that landscape IPM is an aesthetic concern. And so with nursery IPM, you're talking about economics and selling plants. And so therefore the thresholds, the allowable amount of damage is going to be relatively low compared to landscape. And so that's a bit of a challenge I had to even do myself when I changed from landscape to nursery. I had to make that shift in my mindset, realizing, of course, that nurseries do have a low a threshold, aesthetic threshold, because they have to sell these plants, okay? And so if you're doing methods like biological controls, cultural controls, those should always be in place, your first line of defense. But of course, you have to sell these plants, you got to keep them relatively clean. And so certainly there are some pesticides that need to be done and maybe have certain plant pests and diseases. A handful of different modes of action because you still want to rotate them to avoid resistance problems, but be aware of what's available to control certain types of pests. All right, and so always important, I can repeat this constantly, provide written records for this information for each site. It's really important for the future use and continuation. Sometimes you got a person who has a great deal of knowledge and they leave, and if you didn't write all that information down, now that knowledge is lost with the person who's gone, and you have to kind of do it all over again. And so that makes it a little bit less than desirable, to say the least. All right, so you can have a monitoring calendar and schedule that is established, and things like you have insects and mites. And we do this ourselves when we do these webinars. We kind of look at the time of year we're going to be speaking and what type of the month it is, and what kind of problems we're most likely to anticipate. And so you can do the same thing. And so that is really a kind of the key thing with IPM and monitoring is try to keep things relatively simple and to be able to, not make it too complex for yourself. And that's kind of an important thing to remember. As far as how often we need to monitor, I would think with nurseries, it's once every 2 weeks, okay, from late April to about mid-July. And then perhaps as you get into, maybe August, you can begin to cut that back, maybe once every 3 weeks, and then potentially once every 4 weeks. And so the intensity of monitoring requires a little bit less as you move later into the season, all right? But always this depends upon the certain sites and the plants you're dealing with and the pest problems. The firsthand experience of the field technician is the critical person who knows how often it needs to be visited, and so he's keeping that information in place. And so this is kind of a difficult thing to talk about. I don't have a lot of detail with all this information I'm talking about, so it's just a general fundamental overview, but it's something that I keep saying the records are so critical, and that's what needs to be done. Okay. And so has a record system type, has a record keeping been established that, or how are you putting this information down? Well, there's different methods, and certainly on-site worksheets can be done. They could be kind of blank forms with various, categories of the plant that's affected, the pest that's there, obviously the block location that it's at, or the house that it's present, and then what's the percentage of plants, or a species of plant, or sometimes varieties. Varieties makes a big difference, and sometimes our pests are really attracted to certain varieties and not others of the same species, and so you need to be aware of that. And then what's the percentage of that is being affected of the crop, and if it's just like less than 2-3%, maybe it's nothing you need to worry about too much, unless you feel it's going to spread, and then maybe you can get ahead of it before it does. And then also just general comments. What's the action that needs to be done? Is it something that's really important? Are there predators there or parasitoids that are helping keep things under control? And so these are all things that have to be aware. And you can write that down in these little block forms. That's the kind of record keeping form that I do. You want to maybe try to avoid extensive narration. It's kind of awkward to record that type of information. Most important is the fact that good records need to be fast, simple, and most importantly, as I indicated there in the text, needs to be useful. Okay. So these checkoff forms, what I mean by that, you can identify with letters and numbers, certain plant species, and then also, certain pests, insects, diseases, and just check those forms off, and it really makes it quick. And then perhaps try to determine what's the intensity of the problem at each of those sites that you identified. And how do you store this? Well, I mentioned the fact that you can have these checkoff forms, but paperwork gets really monotonous as far as trying to organize that stuff, and it ended up being in 3-ring notebooks, and like in my garage, I've got about 25 years of records from nurseries that I've collected. I mean, do I look at those routinely? No. You need to store these, as everybody realizes now in the digital age. You need to, if you want to write them down in the field, which is fine, but then it needs to be copied or at least scanned, and more importantly, scanned, and so you can put them and store them in a computer. And that's what all my growers do. They take my copy and then they scan it into their computers, and so that's maybe the best way. You can make the attempt of using like an iPad or a handheld type computer in the field. I attempted that several years ago. I had an agent who really wanted me to try it, and I did, and I didn't. I just hated it. And so it's up to the individual. I mean, how is this going to work? And so I tried it, and I didn't like it, but the scanning aspect of it seems to have worked just fine. And so kind of continuation with the record keeping, I think, and make sure you don't overcommit. I think oftentimes if you're first starting off, maybe just a very small, maybe a handful of houses you want to perhaps monitor with this approach, get the experience, gain the confidence, 5% maybe. And as the years go by, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, it really increases with the percentage that you're doing, and you feel like you're making the ability to be quick and efficient with it, and it's profitable and it's useful. And so that all comes into play. And then I indicated here as well that field scouting notes are best scanned and digitized into the computer for future reference, because you really want to use this for the future, so you don't lose that valuable information. as you go from one season to the next, so you can anticipate problems. All right, so as far as equipment available, well, this is something critical as well. There's maybe a half dozen of them that perhaps most monitoring scouts would carry with them. And I carry just about all of these with me that I've listed. There's only about half dozen of them. Most important by far are magnification hand lenses, 10x, 16x. In fact, I have what, 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 5 different magnifications there. I have all 5 of those magnifications. The 3x, which is the optivisor, which is that top photograph at the top, that's for greenhouse I use. I don't find it to be a little bit too cumbersome to use in the nursery. Besides, I want to cover my head with a cap and with a hat, with a wide rim hat. So I don't find that to be useful. But in the greenhouse, I put a baseball cap on. I just reverse it, and so this is a visor that moves up and down. So I can look at yellow sticky cards. I can look at plants. You could use it in the nurseries. Doesn't mean you can't, but I prefer to use a 5x hand lens. It's a wide field of view, and you can scan with that if you're looking for something that looks unusual. And then when you find it and you want to have a higher magnification, then you go with the 10x or the 16x or even the 20x. I know the aerified mites were talked about today. That's about the only time I ever usually use my 20x. But that's such important to have that kind of information. The beading tray, the white beading tray, a really sophisticated piece of equipment. Just it's all it is usually just a white piece of paper, and I use it like a clipboard device, and I wrap foliage with. I have a beading stick I carry with me, which attaches to the clipboard, so it's all handy, readily available, and you can find again maybe easily 6, 7 common pests I have listed there: mites, lace bugs, leafhoppers, aphids, thrips, but also importantly, predators. You can see predators. And it's really kind of critical to use beading trays, especially for spider mites and thrips, because they're so small. And if you rely on just looking at the plants for symptoms, they may not be showing symptoms yet. And so suddenly you do a beading tray test, and wow, there's dozens of them, mites or trips, for example. And so that's important to use. Things like soil probes and hand trowels to investigate the soil and the roots. And of course, hand pruners and pocket knives are self-explanatory. And obviously, monitoring forms. You want to carry those with you, obviously, as well. Okay. And so about spray equipment for a successful IPM program. Well, certainly, ideally, and this is kind of in quotes, ideally, you want to be very selectively applying your treatments. Now, this works well in smaller landscapes. Also, certainly, garden centers where there's not a great amount of area typically. And you can go with a backpack sprayer or a small hand can sprayer. But when we start talking about hundreds of acres, that becomes a little bit difficult. And so that requires, unless you have really precise record keeping where you know exactly where the problems are within these houses or these big container bays, as I prefer to call them, although apparently most greenhouses call them houses. They go with almost all my big nurseries go, as I say there in the photograph, spray dragons. These big, huge devices that are very loud, and they scare me when they start approaching, and I kind of move away. But unfortunately, that's kind of what we're dealing with right now as far as technology with those really big nurseries, because the fact we're trying to be really precise and selective with your sprays with that type, it's kind of problematic. And maybe some of you have had greater success than others, but I know with the biggest nurseries I work with, they they don't really do that, and so it's just too difficult. And economically, it's the way for them to go, and so they don't have the ability to be quite as selective as we would prefer. And so maybe in the future with these drones, perhaps, who knows what the technology lies ahead with these drones. And so we have future work to do with our biggest nurseries and being selective with our sprays. All right, so as far as materials, control materials, pesticides, ideally, again, trying to use the least toxic materials. And okay, and yes, so while the time gets away, doesn't it? My gosh. And so Nursery thresholds are low, obviously, as I indicated before, and so we do have to keep the crops clean, and so we do have to use harsher materials sometimes when it's needed. But there are some, different approaches you can use. There's cultural practices, soil pH, irrigation, sunshade, that all can help to maybe eliminate the problems from the beginning to begin with, and obviously, alternate, plant materials, resistant plant materials are critical as far as that's concerned. Um, Keeping up with research is an important thing as well. There's new materials coming out all the time. These reduced risk materials, they do have a tendency when they first come out to be kind of pricey, but over time, it may take a good number of years. They decrease in their prices. But these reduced risk materials are important to try to use when you can. And we've had our problems with the neonicotinoids and the pollinators. And so things like pheromone traps, we've talked about how to use those sometimes as baits, and as well as lures to attract sexual lures to prevent mating from occurring with the oriental beetle, for example. Great success story with that particular approach, where previously the neonicotinoids were used extensively to control the oriental beetle grubs in the containers. And then we have our new invasive pests that are coming into play as well, that we need to keep up to date. I mean, gosh, we've had a whole good number of them over the last 25 years come in this century with new materials, and we got to keep up with that and know what materials will work against them as well. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to have to end up and save our oils for perhaps next time. But let me just finish up with this one. I'm going to have to swing it back over to Dr. Waller. What about our beneficial insects in nurseries? Can we, can we use them? Well, of course we can. Obviously, insecticides are probably most likely always going to be the most toxic to many of our beneficial insects, especially the broad spectrum. We've talked about broad spectrum insecticides a great deal and how we try not to use them extensively, because you are knocking out all the important predators are trying to help us, and maybe we're killing them unnecessarily sometimes. And probably the best example, especially with nurseries and field nurseries, is with trying to control and keep suppressed with our scales and armored scales, as well as soft scales to a degree, because we have so many good predators that can help us out. But if we continue to use these broad spectrum cover treatments, knocking out all those scale controls. And I'll tell you, scales are really difficult to control if you're going to be relying exclusively on pesticides or insecticides. And so we really want to try to have help with our parasitoid wasps, our predators as well. And so, systemics can be used. Got to be careful though with things like pollinators, as the neonicotinoids has shown. And an interesting statement there, and I'm just about having to finish it, but it says, interesting, that third one down, it says highly toxic pesticides that break down quickly may have less impact on beneficials than those with lower toxicity but longer residuals. So yeah, how about that? Because maybe the high toxic materials are going to knock out everything initially, but they're not going to have a long residual, and so the beneficials can resurge faster, and you have less of a negative impact. But if the lower toxicity is going to persist for long periods of time, many of our predators and parasitoids are really sensitive to just low levels of insecticides and the toxicities, and so the long residuals is not going to be maybe the best thing for them. And it keeps them away and knocks them out of the system for many, many weeks, perhaps. All right, and then we have just the following tips of trying to use pesticides to reduce the mortality. Just a handful of things. We've already know this, I think. Trying to be the selective spot treatments and using soil applied systemic products when they're not going to create problems with pollinators, for example. And then always keeping a track of these biorational insecticides. Oils has been around. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to talk about those today, but things like chlorantraniliprole. I mean, that's a new material that's been around for a few years, but it has such a low toxicity to it, and it has some great value as far as protecting our beneficials as well. All right, so I think I need to put it to a close there, and so thanks for listening to us this year. And so I'm going to bring it over to Tim Waller, and he's going to have our concluding statements and closes out for the last time for this season.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And the slides that are going to progress through here for the dormant oil applications, there's a slide with all of our contact information at the end. Take a look at those. If you have questions, please reach out to us, and we'll be happy to talk about them. So first, I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's been involved with this program throughout the season. It's a wrap for this side of the program, but it's very much just the beginning. We're building a foundation of what we hope to build on year in and year out with this. So there were a couple things that we wanted to leave everyone with. So we're completing a program evaluation and future needs assessment survey. When you see that come out, we will be sending it to all of the people in the program. And we probably will be sending out a broader one for folks that aren't in the program. When you see that, please take that survey. We're doing our best to keep it succinct. But surveys like that are critically important for us to continue getting funds and keeping programs like this going. And we want to know what y'all think. We've got ideas in-house of ways to make this better next year. As you saw today, it's hard to get to every topic all the time. But we want to get to the things that y'all want us to get to. So when you see that survey come out, please take it. We will remind you multiple times about it. So during this time of the season, if you can review your records, go through. If you haven't kept great records, trying to put some semblance of that together, reviewing that information, noting what worked, what didn't work. And any pictures that you have on your phone all throughout the year, if you can compile them into one location, when we meet up and when we talk about these things, having that in front of us, that fast tracks us to being able to figure out a problem for next year. And then staying connected and attending some of the events. So make sure you go in and check out the website. With that foundational component of this, we're working to develop some pocket guides, some printed materials that you can post at the shipping docks, in a break room, etc. Like to get some of those in Spanish as well. And we're also working on some in-person IPM days. And we've got one coming up in October, very soon here, but more early season events, that kind of thing. All right, so I've got the save the date for two events that are coming up in October. We've got an ornamental field twilight meeting. We're going to go over a lot of the traps that we've had. We're going to be talking about boxwoods, invasive pests and diseases, as well as looking at whatever we can with these really cool microscopes that we have. If you've stopped into my office anytime recently, it's the microscope that I pull up that looks like it has an iPad on it. The registration details will be out very soon. I'm hoping to get credits before I put those out, but October 7th and October 20th. We're also going to be doing roundtable discussions like we've done in years past, at least out of Cumberland County, January, February timeframe. And I'd really, really appreciate if we had a more focused conversation around spray regimes. As much as I love standing up and talking in front of everyone, I would really like more discussion around these for these roundtable discussions when it comes to pesticide use. We also have two sessions at the 2026 New Jersey Agriculture Convention and Trade Show. That's in January at Harris. On Wednesday, the 21st, we've got 8 speakers throughout the day. We've got an AM and a PM session. And then there's also a cut flower session if you're interested in that kind of thing on Thursday. But keep an eye out on the Plant and Pest Advisory for updated registration. And this is just a couple of the places you might see us throughout what we call our speaking season. We've got Total Pro, NJNLA, NJLCA's event they hold in the Meadowlands, Turfgrass Association, the Green Expo, and then the New Jersey Arborists Garden State Tree Conference. So you'll probably see us out there, and we're, if we have a booth, please stop by and talk with us. All right, so again, I just want to reiterate, thank you so very much for everyone that's been involved, that has sent us ideas, that has sent us pictures. All that kind of stuff is really, really valuable to us. That's our contact information. Like I said, we're building from here, and I'd also like to have a huge shout out to Erin Quinn, who has really, really stepped up and helped us get these webinars going, helped us build the website. She's been absolutely an awesome asset to this team and really appreciative. So for myself, Bill Erickson, and Steve Recke, just wanted to say thank you. And we'll see you all soon.